Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Eickhoff, and I am the Director of Alumni Operations at John Carroll University. Thank you for joining us for this evening's session of A.C.E.S, the Alumni Continuing Education Series. A.C.E.S was established in the spring of 2013 by the Office of Alumni Relations in the spirit of lifelong learning. The series offers enrichment opportunities for alumni and friends through the expertise of members of the John Carroll administration, faculty, and our larger community. We've hosted a variety of programs on topics such as Alexander Hamilton, the war in Ukraine, the Cleveland Cultural Gardens, the legacy of Larry Doby, and social justice following the murder of George Floyd. Today, we will explore African-American history, specifically the role that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. played into the civil rights movement in Greater Cleveland. This program is part of John Carroll University's celebration of Black History Month, and is being sponsored by the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion, and the John Carroll University Alumni Association. Before I introduce our featured guest, I want to share a few housekeeping items. First, we encourage you to view the program in full screen mode. Additionally, please ensure that you stay muted throughout the duration of the program. Following the presentation, you'll have an opportunity for questions and answers, but we ask that you use the chat feature, and I will ask those questions on your behalf. If there are multiple questions that pertain to the same subject, I'll probably condense them and blend them into one question. It is now my honor to introduce our featured presenter for tonight's program. Dr. Regina N. Williams is a distinguished scholar of African American history and culture at the Western Reserve Historical Society, where she recently launched the A. Grace Lee Mims Arts and Culture Oral History Project. Her honors include Fulbright grants to support teaching and research in Nigeria in 2010 and South Africa in 2019. She currently serves as a research fellow for the Center of Gender and Africa Studies at South Africa's University of the Free State. President of the African American Archives Auxiliary of the Western Reserve Historical Society, and president of the Northeast Ohio chapter of the Fulbright Association. Dr. Williams has conceived, organized, and directed numerous public programs and academic conferences, including those related to the works of Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Carla F.C. Holloway, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington. From 1993 to 2015, she served as a faculty member in the Department of History at Cleveland State University, where she earned tenure and promotion to associate professor and established the Rashad Scholarship Endowment. Her published works include book chapters and articles in scholarly journals, newspapers, and magazines, and she is the founder and editor of the Journal of Traditions and Beliefs and the Traditions and Beliefs newsletter. In 2021, her chapter on race, religion, and reconciliation, academic initiatives, leadership, development, and social change was published in Leadership for Change, developing transformational student leaders through global learning spaces. Dr. Williams, how are you doing this evening? Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention the name of one of my longtime mentors, who was a longtime staff member there at John Carroll University, because I'm guessing there's probably at least one person in the Zoom room who remembers Dr. Shirley Smith Seaton. She was a governing board member at the Western Reserve Historical Society, and certainly longtime trustee for the African American Archives Auxiliary of the Western Reserve Historical Society. And also one of those colleagues that you absolutely need. If you think you're going to go places in the academy, you need someone like her to mentor you and write those letters of recommendation and help you get the first Fulbright fellowship. So you're in league with scholars like her who have traveled the world, and where we go, we take American history with us. So thanks to John Carroll for making the smart decision to hire Dr. Shirley Smith Seaton. Unfortunately, the late, great Shirley Smith Seaton. But I want to get started with the presentation. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight. I say only half in jest that Black History Month is my busy season. in that it seems like everybody in town wants to give a presentation or wants you to give a presentation in February. And then usually we have 28 days to work with, but I'm so very happy that people are interested in the history of this country from the vantage point of African descended people. So again, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to be with you. Want to acknowledge the following organizations because there's material included in this presentation that I obtained from each of them. First and foremost, the Western Reserve Historical Society, speaking of Cleveland series, both the library and digital Cleveland starts here. If you go to our website, WRHS.org, you can look at some of the primary documents, some of the images even that I will share tonight. They're available online, low resolution versions of those digital images, but much higher resolutions are available if you need them for publications or for other purposes. Certainly there's a brand new Cleveland Civil Rights Trail. There are lots of articles about that. It's the Cleveland Restoration Society that took the lead in establishing that with a grant that they received not so very long ago, but they're doing incredible work. And maybe we'll get to talk a little bit more about that work when we'll get into the Q&A session. Cleveland Public Library, the People's University, always a great source for folks who want to do research, whether they're at the K-12 level or post-secondary level. Amazing collections. It's a wonderful research library and also very user-friendly. So I always find myself going back to Cleveland Public Library collections and databases as well as books. And last but not least, the Cleveland Memory Project at Cleveland State University is another great digital resource where lots of images are available, and also entire books are also published by the library's, the director's office actually gets involved in helping people to publish peer-reviewed scholarship in journals and also in books. So that's my alma mater ×4, and also the place where I spent about 30 years of my life either teaching or serving as a staff member, but great things continue to happen on the campus of that public university. And some of the best things I'd have to say are happening in the Michael Schwartz Library on that campus. Want to say also that there are a number of secondary sources that I considered for this presentation. There won't be a lot of text, but I would like to call your attention to these books from left to right. Black America series, the Cleveland, Ohio book. That little book is 21 years old this year, but I had the opportunity to publish that when I was on the faculty at Cleveland State University. It's an Images of America book. And yes, there's some images of Dr. King and some of the other individuals, especially ministers, that he interacted with when he was here in the city of Cleveland. This book in the center, A Call to Conscience, is an edited volume of some of his better known speeches. And I've been referring to that quite a bit during the season of King commemorative activities. And on the far right, by attorney James Robinall, Ballots and Bullets, looks at, again, this turbulent decade of the 60s, and especially concentrates on that era from 1966, 67, when the city is experiencing widespread Black nationalist activity, especially on the East Side. And it's also the era in which we get the election of the first African-American mayor of a major American city, and that's Carl Burton Stokes, and he is shown here in the center. Ballots and Bullets, Black Power Politics, and Urban Guerrilla Warfare in 1968 Cleveland. And 68, of course, significant for a number of reasons, but for the purposes of this presentation, the year in which Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. And just a note about some of the dates that will appear on the slides. Again, in the header of the slides, if I include a date, usually refers to the date associated with one of Dr. King's visits to the city of Cleveland, not necessarily the date of the photograph shown. When we consider Dr. King's work here in the city of Cleveland, I thought it would be useful to talk about how the activities that we'll mention and going through these slides sort of line up with the national timeline for civil rights activities, especially the major ones that take place in the South, where we have primarily a church-based movement, but also national decisions handed down by the Supreme Court, certainly signaling the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. As far as a lot of historians are concerned, we look at 1954 in that school desegregation case that's usually just referred to as Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. When the court hands down that unanimous ruling in May of 1954, suggesting that segregated schools are unconstitutional because they violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Again, we believe, many of us who study the civil rights era, that there's going to be an opening up of the society once the segregated institutions are done away with. Many people coming to believe in the 1950s that education is a fundamental right, and that without educational opportunities, Black people would never enjoy the full citizenship rights that they were entitled to as free people in the society. So again, starting in the 1950s, but again, this is the Supreme Court. This Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama that lasts from December of 1955 through December of 1956, just over a year, launches the public movement, as many of you know, that's associated with the leadership of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So he's 26 years old when he's a newly minted PhD, and his leadership skills come to the attention of the organizers of that boycott. 1963, again, I'm skipping over a lot of things, but this is a major watershed in the movement itself with the March on Washington in August of 1963. Among other things, Dr. King will deliver his very famous and often repeated "I Have a Dream" speech. Speaks very profoundly on that occasion to about 250,000 people gathered there on the National Mall. And then with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, we see that many of us who are students and teachers of history as the most comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation to that point in our history, signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And then 1965, again, this is happening in the summer, the Voting Rights Act, signed into law in August of 1965, comes on the heels of that Selma to Montgomery march that included Dr. King and religious leaders from all over the country, very much an ecumenical movement. But again, this is in that state of Alabama, and going to the state capitol, insisting that those political rights that have been denied African Americans be given recognition. And they get that in the form of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 1967, we see Dr. King experiencing a major loss in popularity because on that date, April 4th, 1967, when he gives a speech at the Riverside Church, going public and stating his opposition to the war in Vietnam, there are many people, including African Americans, who come to believe that Dr. King is really meddling in something that's none of his business as a civil rights leader. And they believe, because there are disproportionately high numbers of Black and brown young men risking their lives on the battlefields of Southeast Asia, that he's a traitor in many ways to those people of color who believe that they are doing a good thing by serving the nation in the time of war. So again, that will be the beginning of the last year of his life, April 4th, 1967. And again, on April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. King will be assassinated. But in the wake of his assassination, the Poor People's Campaign would continue. So again, those are just some of the major dates that I want us to try to keep in mind as we move quickly now through the slides that are associated with activities that happen in Cleveland. Now, by way of introduction, let me just share this statement. The presentation will focus on Dr. King's many visits to Cleveland, Ohio in the 1960s, the purpose of those visits, the individuals and organizations that work with him, and Cleveland's place in the larger history of the civil rights movement in America, the one that's outlined in that list of dates that we just went through. The lecture discussion will include a consideration of the churches and other local landmarks associated with Dr. King's work in this great city. This idea of going there, knowing there, didn't originate with me. I'm borrowing this from Zora Neale Hurston's, I'd like to say her greatest novel, certainly the one that I fell in love with about 42 years ago, the first time that I read it, Their Eyes Were Watching God, published in 1937, toward the end of the Harlem Renaissance period in American literary history. And if I can do this in the way that I think Hurston might read it, then I will have captured the spirit of the Black vernacular speech that she liked to use in a lot of her work, reflecting a Negro way of saying things, especially in the first half of the 20th century in the American South. So she has a character, Janie, who's talking to her best friend, Phoebe. And she says, and I'm pulling this from Their Eyes Are Watching God, Phoebe, you got to go there to know there. Your papa and your mama and nobody else can tell you and show you. Two things everybody's got to do for themselves. They got to go to God and they got to find out about living for themselves, close quote. And why start there? I think it means a lot with all of the great cities in the country in the 1960s that Dr. King came back to the city of Cleveland over and over again, and that he had his lieutenants on the ground here in the city of Cleveland, certainly among other Baptist Black ministers, but also people who were Jewish and in the suburban communities of greater Cleveland. So again, want to give Cleveland its props in talking about the role that it played in changing hearts and changing minds and shaping public opinion during the civil rights movement, as we've outlined it here, working in tandem with Dr. King and other great leaders of that era. And so we want to note also that Dr. King was a very young leader. Mentioned that he was 26 years old when he was affiliated with that Montgomery bus boycott lasting from 1955 to 1956, but born January 15, 1929 and assassinated April 4th, 1968. I want to begin with this whole discussion of Cleveland by saying this is the building that's associated with Dr. King's first visit that's on the public record to the city of Cleveland as a recognized civil rights leader. And he's coming to the city of Cleveland, to the Hollenden House in particular, because there's a convention of funeral home directors meeting there. And they are, as I'm sure many of you know, some of the most successful businessmen in the Black community. So these are independent Black funeral home directors. And he came here on a fundraising trip, and he was able to raise money for the Southern-based civil rights movement that was taking off in America in the 1950s. So this is one of the earliest visits, again, that we associate with his being in Cleveland and being a leader, an acknowledged leader in the mainstream civil rights movement. But I also want to talk a little bit about this church. In this period in the 1960s, the Antioch Baptist Church, which is still located at 89th and Cedar Avenue in the city of Cleveland, was also one of the headquarters for civil rights activism here in the city of Cleveland. And I would have to say now, and please know that this is my home church. So I'm not, yes, I'm biased, right? I'm not the objective scholar. When I talk about the role of Antioch Baptist Church in the history of Black church activism in Ohio, I'm saying this as someone who's a member now of the congregation, just joined last year, but pretty much a lifelong Baptist. But at this point in time, The pastor of the Antioch Baptist Church was the Reverend Dr. Wade Hampton McKinney, and he is shown here in this Alan Cole photo in a collection at the Western Reserve Historical Society with his wife, Ruth Berry McKinney. But Antioch is still one of the leading congregations in the Black faith community, and Reverend McKinney, like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a graduate of Morehouse College. And so this idea of preparing Black men for leadership in general, but civil rights activism and political leadership in particular, is something that has long been associated with that men's college in Atlanta, Georgia, and that is Morehouse College. Dr. King went there when he was only 15 years old, and beyond that went on to do even greater things. I want to say also, as I mentioned in the introduction, that it was not just in Cleveland proper that Dr. King came to the city of Cleveland. And so we know for the record that he visited the St. Paul Episcopal Church in 1963, the year in which he gave not only the I Have a Dream speech in August of 1963, but tragically, just 3 weeks after the conclusion of that march, there was a church bombed in Birmingham, Alabama in September of 1963, and 4 little girls were killed in that church bombing, and many others were injured. But he eulogized those children as well in Birmingham, Alabama, also known as Birmingham. So again, there's much truth associated with the civil rights movement as a church-based Southern movement, but again, want to say that there are many allies in the churches of the North and many allies that are actually outside of faith communities as we've defined them in some of the images that you'll see shortly. But this is one of the most popular stops for individuals who need a large space that can accommodate a large group of people, especially on the east side of Cleveland. That's the Corey United Methodist Church on East 105th Street. But certainly in 1963, not only is Dr. King visiting that church, but also Malcolm X is visiting there. And that's where Malcolm X gives his ballot or the bullet speech. But it's a very popular place. And this is just outside the Corey United Methodist Church. These pillars, important features of the architecture there. And for people who are familiar with the early 20th century history of Corey United Methodist Church, you will know that this is in Glenville, and that also this was the center of Jewish religious and social activism, at least through the first 4 decades of the 20th century. But as the neighborhood began to change, as a result of the in-migration of Blacks from the rural South and the greater concentration of their numbers in Glenville, with many of the Jewish congregations moving further east to communities like Cleveland Heights or Beechwood, Corey United Methodist Church was one of those anchor institutions. And again, this is just the crowd outside the church that was gathered there in 1963 to hear Dr. King speak. I love these cars. Interesting, once Corey United Methodist Church was filled, there were spillover churches that could accommodate some of the crowds, and Dr. King could make various stops along East 105th Street. Sometimes I call this Church Row, but one of the places that they took in others of the people who were standing outside and not able to be accommodated at Corey was the Greater Abyssinia Baptist Church. Now, this is the interior of Corey in 1963, but just down the street, Greater Abyssinia Baptist Church, the Reverend Emmett Theophilus Cavanis, still the pastor there, but was a close associate of Dr. King. Reverend Cavanis has been the pastor of Greater Abyssinia for more than 60 years, but still very active in SCLC. And that, of course, was the organization that Dr. King and his fellow pastors founded as soon as the Montgomery bus boycott concluded. So in January of 1957 that we have the official launching of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that also had offices in the North. And Reverend, again, Cavanis, one of the young leaders of the SCLC during Dr. King's lifetime, and still very active today. Interestingly enough, another person who came to Cleveland quite a few times, I heard her tell a story about having a job at May Company and getting fired here in Cleveland. But Dr. Maya Angelou was associated with the leadership of the SCLC in the North in Dr. King's lifetime. This picture also, I think, is very important because it suggests, again, the importance of interreligious activism during the heyday of the Civil Rights Movement. Again, this is a picture that gets reproduced a lot from the Selma to Montgomery March, which occurred in March of 1965. And that's also in Alabama. We see Dr. King here. I don't recognize any Clevelanders in the group, but I do want to call your attention to the fact that this is Ralph Abernathy on Dr. King's right. This is Dr. Ralph Bunch, who was a great leader in his own right, not a religious leader, but a more famous religious leader, or equally famous when we talk about his work and Dr. King's work in the 1960s is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He and Dr. King met for the first time in January of 1963. And as I'd like to say to audiences, at that point in time, Dr. Heschel, who was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1907 and narrowly escapes the Holocaust when he obtains permission to travel to Ohio and gets a job in Cincinnati. He becomes one of the greatest followers of this young civil rights leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And when Dr. King sent out this call for religious leaders to join him in Alabama, Rabbi Heschel was one of the individuals who answered that call. And we'll see again, it's an interracial movement, interreligious movement under Dr. King's leadership in Cleveland and other places, and it's intergenerational. And so this is a very young John Lewis that you probably recognize him here as one of the leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But again, want to talk about some of the religious leaders in Ohio who were also involved in various activities and based here on America's North Coast in the city of Cleveland. So this image from the Sheraton Cleveland in 1965 includes some individuals who should be very familiar to a lot of you. Let me point out some of the ones that I recognize immediately when I look at this picture. This is the Reverend Dr. Odie M. Hoover, who was a longtime pastor of the Olivet Institutional Baptist Church in the Fairfax community. After he passed away, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr. became pastor, and beyond him, today, the Reverend Dr. Jawanza Colvin, but it's still one of the largest Black congregations here in Northeast Ohio and still associated with social activism and social justice and civil rights activism. Olivet, a member of the Greater Cleveland Congregations Group, and still focusing on many of those activities that Dr. King and Dr. Hoover focused on in the 1960s. And of course, this is Dr. King in the center. And next to him is the Reverend Dr. John Wheaton, who was the longtime pastor of the St. Timothy Baptist Church on Carnegie now, here in the city of Cleveland. And so again, these are some of the most influential leaders, Black and white, in the civil rights movement who gathered at the Sheraton in 1965, again, the year in which we get the signing into law of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I wanted to also mention, in talking about the interreligious nature of the civil rights movement that Dr. King was at the helm of, the work of Rabbi Arthur Lilyville, reminding us again that Jewish people were among the leaders that Dr. King could count on, not just for the marching and the activism, but also to work in tandem with him to raise funds to support the civil rights movement in the South, and also some of the activities that were being conducted in the North. It was quite a Herculean task to organize the staff for all of those offices, both North and South, that kept the civil rights machine, if you will, moving forward. So again, we associate the work of Rabbi Lilyville not only with the marches in the South, but also with his leadership in the Jewish community as a rabbi, certainly for many years in Beechwood. And if we can go again to another community, faith community in Cleveland, this is the Heights Christian Church, where Dr. King had an opportunity to speak in 1965. And there's some interesting stories told about this church. One of the versions that I heard told by the Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell, who was, when I met her in the 21st century, the director of religion at the Chautauqua Institution in New York. But some of us also know that her daughter was the mayor of the city of Cleveland. So she's the mother of former Mayor Jane Campbell here in the city of Cleveland. But what happened in 1965 when Dr. King came to speak at that church, the leaders of the church were a little shy. And some things happened and he was not allowed to speak in the sanctuary, but he came here to speak, and speak he did. And so I wanted you to see, if I can go back a minute, this is the door, right? This is the porch area, if you will, if I'm describing that part of the architecture correctly, on the Heights Christian Church in 1965. And this is a grainy image from some video that was shot from that same porch where Dr. King delivered his address. And this is, again, one of his lieutenants, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who has his back when he's here in Greater Cleveland. But I like this example because that's a grainy screenshot from a grainy video that's available on YouTube. So this is happening in July of 1965 from that same video. And again, that same area where Dr. King is speaking, that's this porch here. But there were people who came to hear him. Again, this is a suburban community, well, just across the border from Cleveland. But still, they're at this church where, and I think it's fair to say there was a very progressive congregation, majority white congregation, that considered bringing him here, but decided against holding the presentation featuring Dr. King in the sanctuary of the church. But again, I think it's an important moment in our history, and certainly one that the Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell wrote about in her book that she autographed for me when I met her at Cleveland State. So this is Reverend Joan, Living into Hope, a call to spiritual action for such a time as this. And I'm sure most of the listeners know she's a very influential leader in religious circles, National Council of Churches, and someone who was also a great leader, I would have to say, among thought leaders, if we can say that, about those crowds that gather at Chautauqua every summer to hear from her and to hear from other leaders who come there for the special gatherings that are taking place in that particular community in New York. Now, this is very important too for young people who had the opportunity as students at Glenville High School to hear Dr. King in 1967. And again, this takes place in April. So this is after he delivers that speech at Riverside. And it's hard to tell here that he's lost any of his popularity because most of the people gathered here were actually the honor students at Glenville, and quite pleased to be meeting with someone that they consider to be still one of their heroes in late April of 1967. I will say also of this visit to the city of Cleveland that there is a recording of Dr. King's speech. It was a tape. Someone found it in a library collection at Glenville. They digitized it, so it's available. I know it was accessible through cleveland.com, but you might want to listen to it. It's quite a moving speech. He includes poetry, and he's just a great extemporaneous speaker. And the students, based on their applause, seemed to really enjoy what he had to say to them at that time. And again, this is in the era of the Vietnam War. So a lot of the young men that you see here would be drafted soon after their graduation from that public high school here in the city of Cleveland. Also, Dr. King was here in 1967 to speak with individuals who were participating in a widespread rent strike. And this is just an image that appeared in many newspapers where he's in one of these dilapidated buildings where people were living and pointing out some of the architectural defects in this building in 1967. This again is from the Glenville High School, April of 1967, when he speaks there in their gym. This is in the Mount Pleasant community on the east side of Cleveland. Mount Pleasant, one of the major thoroughfares being Kinsman Road, was a middle-class community where many Blacks in the first half of the 20th century actually purchased land and built their homes. Not as prosperous as today as it was then, but again, it was an area where there were a lot of voters. And so it was worth Dr. King's time to go to the Mount Pleasant community and speak in 1967. Again, this is the year in which we get the election of Carl Burton Stokes as the first Black mayor of the city of Cleveland. But as a campaign strategy, Dr. King was not very often seen in the company of Carl Stokes because Cleveland was not a majority Black city. It was approximately 1/3 Black. And it was felt by some of the people involved in the campaign for the election of Mayor Stokes that if the white West Side saw Mayor Stokes as sort of an ally to these radical civil rights leaders, perhaps he would lose the white vote. But there were enough Blacks and enough whites who in this year after the Huff riots decided to take a chance on Carl Stokes and elect him mayor, hoping certainly that we would not witness again as residents of this city the kind of violence that was associated, I called it the Huff riot, but associated with the uprising in the Huff community on the east side of Cleveland in the long hot summer of 1966. So again, Mount Pleasant, middle class Black community in the 1960s, where Dr. King is speaking on, you can tell this is sort of the back of a flatbed truck. And I believe, Professor Eric, that this is the same image that I saw in the cover slide that you shared with me just before we call this gathering to order. This is another, I think, important moment in Northeast Ohio history because Dr. King, of course, the shorter one here in the white shirt, is shown with one of his younger lieutenants who actually dropped out of college in North Carolina to join the civil rights movement. And you probably recognize him as the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who's much older now and has had some major health problems in recent years. But Jesse Jackson continued activism beyond Dr. King's assassination in April of 1968. And Jesse Jackson, usually associated with, in the minds of a lot of people, Operation Breadbasket. So it's a fundraising arm of the civil rights movement. And Jesse Jackson also enjoyed popularity, not just here in Ohio or in the South when he was a student in North Carolina, but also on the South side of Chicago. But he's shown here in Greater Cleveland at the Yankee Clipper in 1967 with Dr. King and some of his other lieutenants. This image also is very important. This is taken at the Greater Avery African Methodist Episcopal Church in sort of the, if I can say, the Glenville University Circle area in 1967. And the man shown here next to Dr. King is Fred Ahmed Evans. And I mentioned the title by Jim Robinow, Ballots and Bullets. Fred Ahmed Evans is someone who is associated in 1968 with the Glenville shootout and the unrest that followed it, in which a number of people were killed, including white policemen. But the interesting thing about this particular gathering, it found him sitting on the same side of the table with Dr. King and others. This is a detail from another picture that gets reproduced a lot. This is a ghetto grand jury. And in this summer of 1967, there had been reports issued suggesting that the people in the Huff community chose to engage in rioting because they were encouraged to do so by outside agitators. And so this jury assembled, and again, it's a bookland account in Jim Romanow's book about what's happening in 1966, 67, and 68 with the Glenville shootout, to say that living conditions in Huff were in fact so poor. Refuse collection, substandard schools, overcrowded and dilapidated housing, all of those things pushed the poor people who were concentrated in that community to the brink. And so the ghetto grand jury hears from some of the eyewitnesses to what happened in Huff and what was happening in other communities. And they suggest that it is the poverty and the racism and the ongoing segregation that caused those kinds of problems, not just in cities like Cleveland, but also cities all over the North and the South. And there would be other statements similar to the ones issued by this ghetto grand jury that assembled at the Greater Avery African Methodist Episcopal Church in the form of that Kerner Commission report, Mr. Otto Kerner, again, sharing that. But again, Dr. King focusing not just on civil rights, but economic and political rights. I think that's a very important point for us to continue to make. And then this is my final slide. Again, this is toward the end of Dr. King's public career, because we're getting toward the end of his life. But this is a book that's published in 1967, The King Legacy. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? I'd have to say it's a question that many people are asking today, including a lot of us who listened to the State of the Union address delivered by President Joe Biden. But I would like to conclude by reading some of the words of Dr. King, not from 1967, and not from a speech as delivered here in the city of Cleveland, although he certainly touched on these topics, but this is from the concluding address from the Selma to Montgomery March in March of 1965. And I think it's important to end on this note, because he is suggesting that he is not just that dreamer, not to suggest that dreamers are, inconsequential, but dreamers are pretty important. But he's a visionary leader who envisions an America that would deal with some of these most pressing issues that certainly caused a lot of the unrest, many people would say, in the Huff community, but also in other areas in Black America or in poor communities in general. He says at the end of that march, let us therefore continue our triumphant march to the realization of the American dream. Let us march on segregated housing until every ghetto of social and economic depression dissolves, and Negroes and whites live side by side in decent, safe, and sanitary housing. Let us march on segregated schools until every vestige of segregated and inferior education becomes a thing of the past, and Negroes and whites study side by side in the socially healing context of the classroom. Let us march on poverty until no American parent has to skip a meal so that their children may eat. March on poverty until no starved man walks the streets of our cities and towns in search of jobs that do not exist. Let us march on poverty until wrinkled stomachs in Mississippi are filled and the idle industries of Appalachia are realized and revitalized, and broken lives and sweltering ghettos are mended and remolded. Let us march on ballot boxes. March on ballot boxes until race baiters disappear from the political arena. Let us march on ballot boxes until the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs will be transformed into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Let us march on ballot boxes until the Wallaces of our nation tremble away in silence. Let us march on ballot boxes until we send to our city councils, state legislatures, and the United States Congress men who will not fear to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with their God. Close quote. I am going to stop sharing the screen now, if I may, and hold up this book in the hope that it won't be too much of a distraction. Let me see if I can do this as well. And then, because I want to call your attention to a wonderful exhibit. Maybe some of you have seen it already. This is the catalog for an exhibit that's at the Maltz Museum in Beechwood. And certainly you're going to see images, a rather disturbing image of Rabbi Lilieveld in this book. If I can just show it here. He was one of those religious leaders who answered the call. This is him when he got his head bloodied in Mississippi in Freedom Summer in 1964. And again, this is one of those images that gets reproduced a lot. This one also by Herbert Randall in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, 1964. But again, I'm hoping there are people in the audience who perhaps had the good fortune to know Rabbi Lilieveld or to worship as a member of his congregation. I am told by Professor Eric that he was a faculty member for a time at John Carroll University. So hopefully we'll get to hear more about his works in the classroom too, before we wrap things up tonight. But this exhibit and a whole series of companion programs hosted by the Maltz Museum, this will continue through April of 2023. It's going to continue through April of 2023. And I hope that you will see the exhibit. Very powerful, but again, very disturbing images. There were some ugly things going on in Mississippi, and a lot of people who were injured and many who died. It wasn't just Dr. King and Medgar Evers. But again, it's a powerfully, I think, moving tribute to the people who participated in the movement and worked side by side with Dr. King. And there are many religious leaders here. You'll see some other images of Rabbi Heschel as well in that particular exhibit. So I want to put this book down and thank you all for your attention. I see that there's a lot of activity in the chat room. Professor Eric, would you like to handle this, or shall I?
Yeah, I would love to. So thank you so much again, Dr. Williams, for helping with today's program and sharing your research and about Dr. King's legacy in Northeast Ohio. We got some great questions in the chat, and I'm going to go through a couple of them. One that came to me as you were speaking is just in general, how would you describe how Cleveland reacted to Dr. King's presence, whether that be specific African-American communities? You said the mostly white West Side. What were the different dynamics in the different areas of Cleveland when Dr. King would visit?
I would have to say, based on, again, some of that primary source evidence that I've had a chance to examine, especially the news articles in the Column Post and the accompanying photographs, Dr. King was really well received throughout most of his career as a civil rights leader here in the city of Cleveland. And that image outside the Core United Methodist Church on East 105th Street in 1963, that was typical. But and it wasn't just there on East 105th. The same thing would happen at Olivet, at East 89th Street in Quincy. Similar things would happen at Emmanuel Baptist Church, which is on 79th Street in Quincy. I'm sort of drawing maps on the tabletop here, but and also well received at the white churches. In the suburban communities. It just seemed to me that there were some leaders, and I don't know what the source of the fear was, if people were threatening to withdraw financial support. But again, I just believe what the Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell said about the nervousness, but she was proud of the congregation that they allowed him to speak, despite the reluctance on the part of some of the leaders who could have opened up that sanctuary. I don't know, are there any people on the call this evening who were present at any of those lectures? I will say, for example, the young girl who was shaking the hand of Dr. King in Glenville, she went on to be a teacher. And although, you know, she tried to be retired for a while, I think she's 77 years old now. I'm gonna have to think about that math because she was 17, you know, then. But again, she's in her 70s, okay, and she is still teaching, post-retirement teaching, but had a great career as an educator. But again, you know, there are other questions or other comments from who heard Dr. King speak, or?
Well, we have another question that came in, and this is talking about the relations between the Black community and the Jewish community and how they've changed over years. Maybe a good question is how could we improve them? Maybe a good question would be, how would Dr. King maybe think about them having changed and having been in solidarity with so many people of you know, of the leaders of the Jewish community?
Well, lately I've been looking at the readings of Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel, especially in the 1960s, their public addresses or their conference presentations. So not the informal present, but things that were carefully worded and carefully structured, and then later published, you know, because they spoke volumes. They made a lot of enemies. They were, both of them, by 1967, were outspoken in their opposition to the war in Vietnam. And again, if I can say this, it's as true of my Black Baptist community as it was of some of the Jewish communities of the 1960s, that my upbringing, you know, my education within the church, very parochial. A lot of people didn't necessarily like the fact that Dr. King was forming these alliances with leaders of other faith communities. And so the relations were strained for a number of reasons. I've read things where, well, people often criticize Rabbi Heschel for being involved with so many Gentiles. You know? And so again, some of the things that happened, but he didn't do, let me say this about his activism, as far as I can tell. Now, there's a lot about Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King that I have not read, but I'm getting through, and there's so many books that are being produced now. Now that we're 50 years beyond the passing of Rabbi Heschel, who died in December of 1972, there are a lot of things that are coming to the fore. But there were a lot of firsts. You know, Rabbi Heschel was the first non-Christian to speak at the Union Theological Seminary and to serve on the faculty there. That was the 1960s. And you would think, you know, the civil rights movement is old by then, you know, and why should they're both right there in the same, the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Union Theological, but there were those divisions within the faith communities. And Rabbi Heschel would talk about the daughter religions of Judaism, talking about Christianity and Islam, that they didn't always see eye to eye, politically or religiously. So yes, and I think we also have to say that the people who were involved in the civil rights movement, they were in the minority. Everybody didn't march on Washington. There's about 200,000 Black people and 50,000 white people who gathered there on the National Mall in August of 1963. Most people stayed at home. I've had people, one of my mentors who was born in Tuscaloosa and educated in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who told me he was afraid to be involved in the civil rights movement. And he was, roughly a contemporary with Dr. King, born there in the 1930s. Dr. King born in 1929. So again, the strained relations within the Black and Jewish communities, some of the things, when people talk about neighborhood change, for example, the fact that Glenville was formerly a Jewish community, they talk a lot about slum landlords, that a lot of those properties that were divided up in Glenville and had originally housed maybe 2 families, were divided up into, multi-family dwelling units, and there were absentee landlords. And, this is just a quick way to dismiss, and there's some anti-Semitism, I think, that informs a lot of these discussions, that some of these absentee landlords were Jewish. And so that's not a full explanation of what happens in Glenville and why the neighborhood changes in the way that it's, because there were times, if we look at the school years for people like, let me think about some of those famous people who graduated from Glenville High School. For writers, well, Sam Miller, I believe, graduated from Glenville High School, right? Somebody's nodding, okay, but he wasn't a writer, but a very successful businessman. Adrian Kennedy graduated from Glenville High School when it was both Jewish and Black. So there were times when Black people and Jewish people lived peaceably in Glenville, okay? But there was that exodus to the suburbs, and sometimes the covenants were restrictive in a way that Blacks couldn't as easily get into some of those exclusive neighborhoods, if I can put it that way, as far as the eastern suburbs are concerned. Now, I see we have more comments in the chat.
We do.
Somebody help me with this, because I'm struggling.
Well, why don't we, because I want to get to everyone's questions, why don't we get through a couple more? And then I have a really great comment, and maybe you can help with this. So a couple people asked about Dr. King's relationships with what I would say are leaders or well-known individuals within the Black community in Cleveland. So one is Jim Brown. Did the Reverend King have a relationship with Jim Brown, because he was fairly outspoken in certain areas? And then the Stokes brothers. And then I don't think he was here still, but if there's any connection to like a Larry Doby, who helped break the color barrier in the American League in Cleveland. So did King have any what were those relationships with some of those higher profile Black leaders in the Cleveland community?
Well, there is one that I definitely want to mention, and he's an attorney, attorney Stanley Tolliver. Stanley E. Tolliver, and he was at that. He was at the table too, at the ghetto grand jury, and he was the official lawyer in the city of Cleveland for Dr. King. When he was working through the A.C.E.S here, and involved with other Black attorneys as well. But Stanley Tolliver certainly is someone who is there, and he is the one who is taking the cases of people like Fred Ahmed Evans and other activists, not just the ones who get caught up in the violence, but other people who can't necessarily pay for legal services. And again, have cases, many of them had been miseducated in public schools of the South, or their education had been very limited, and they were poor and working class people. And so Stanley Tolliver is that person. For a time, his daughter said to me, Sherry Tolliver, who was one of the trustees for the African American Archives Auxiliary, Mr. Tolliver called himself the ghetto lawyer. And he was very proud of the fact that he was a ghetto lawyer who worked with people who couldn't necessarily pay the full amount for the services that he provided. But he knew that the services, to have an attorney when you're going to court, very valuable. And so in time, his friend encouraged him to call himself the people's lawyer. So this people's lawyer in the person of Stanley E. Tolliver, certainly high profile, not just here in the city of Cleveland, but also in the civil rights movement nationally, and also in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. So he is one. But Reverend Hoover, Odie Hoover, who I pointed out in the picture, certainly he was high profile, and he had some ties to the South. You know, he had spent some years in Tennessee, but his daughter, Carol Hoover, was a very successful businesswoman. She spent a lot of years working with Dr. King during the civil rights era and went on to be very successful in business circles here in the city of Cleveland. And she and her sister, Pat Hoover, were among the speakers who shared their thoughts on the civil rights movement here in the city of Cleveland at the Maltz Museum. That was on January 11th. So it's quite an interesting lineup of the high profile leaders who are still with us. There were young leaders then, a little bit older now, but the Hoover family had more than one leader, certainly in the person of the Reverend Odie M. Hoover and also of Miss Carol Hoover.
Thank you for that. And I guess the last question I would have is from a colleague of mine. Were there any protests or demonstrations against Dr. King's presence in Cleveland by people who were against the civil rights movement or equality?
There are some really interesting images that I saw in the press collection, which is housed in Library of Special Collections, the Schwartz Library at Cleveland State University. Michael Schwartz Library used to be just the main library there, but it's in Rhodes Tower, Special Collections on the 3rd floor. And a lot of these images have been digitized too. So you can find them on the Cleveland Memory website that I mentioned. But I'll never forget this one photo that I saw, and it was 1967-68, but it was a Black group, very well dressed, and they were protesting, holding signs that said, "Dr. King, traitor to our boys in Vietnam." And I thought, wow, this is powerful. So we have then, if I can say, mainline civil rights supporters in the late 1960s who were not in favor of the anti-war activism that Dr. King begins to engage in April of 1967 in a very formal way, and then in that final year of his life. But also in this period of growing Black nationalism, there were people, especially in the Black Panther Party for self-defense, who thought that Dr. King was a little too conservative. And so we see in that second half of the 1960s, people like Stokely Carmichael, who would adopt the name Kwame Ture, who would begin to gravitate more towards the teachings of Malcolm X. Although Malcolm is gone, he's assassinated in 1965 in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, New York. But again, self-defense, those things are important to a lot of the younger leaders in the second half of the 1960s. And when they began to cry Black power, especially in 1966 and beyond that, it causes them, to move further left, if you will, of where Dr. King chose to remain through the end of his life. So yes, there were people who were opposed to some of the conservative, nonviolent tactics used by Dr. King, because again, so many people were dying.
Mm-hmm.
So many of those nonviolent protesters were dying very violently, and they were Black and white, and they were Jews and Gentiles, and they were men and women and children who were dying. So again, self-defense became a rallying cry, especially after 1966 with that Black Power movement. And yes, we had Panthers here in the city of Cleveland, as well as other areas of the country.
So it was truly more people who were wanting him to go further in the civil rights movement, as opposed to people saying, we don't want, you shouldn't have your civil rights. Or were there people on that side of the spectrum too who were demonstrating or protesting against, King's efforts for the civil rights movement?
Oh, absolutely, especially in the South, among members of the Ku Klux Klan and other similar white nationalist group. We would see, not just the NAACP protesting in the city of Cleveland, but we would see. Now, I hope I get the letters right. I think it's the National Association for White People, but I know that they protested efforts to desegregate the schools here in the city of Cleveland. And again, with the building of so many schools in Glenville and the relay classes where the schools were so overcrowded, some students would come in the morning for 3.5 hours of education, and then the second shift would come in, those relay classes, and then they build more schools to keep Blacks in the overcrowded Black community. There were a lot of people who were opposed to opening up neighborhoods, desegregating housing and the schools in the city of Cleveland. So yes, to answer your question, there were people, and there's evidence to suggest that they were marching too. There were counter marches to the civil rights marches here in the city of Cleveland, as well as in other parts of the country.
All right. So I got one last question for you, and maybe it's not so much a question; it's more of some help from a historian. So Mary Evans sent me a message privately.
Okay.
She was in the Glenview auditorium when Dr. King spoke.
Okay.
And she was wondering if you knew if that speech was recorded, and if so, do you know where she might be able to get it?
Yes, that Glenville speech is the one that was digitized, the tape that was digitized. I heard it on cleveland.com.
Okay.
And I think there's a transcript there as well. And so, if you go to cleveland.com and, just search, all the right terms, Dr. King, Glenville High School, April 1967, you're going to get a number of hits. Because the smart people who know how to download that, and then upload it somewhere else, they're out there doing their thing too. Or you can make your own recording. If you're playing it back, you can make your own. So, but yes, it is definitely available online. And I really enjoyed listening to it. The students, they were right there with him, and he did this more than once, but there is a line where he talks about, and so whatever you do, do it well. Should you find that it's your lot to sweep streets, then you want to sweep streets better than anybody else. You want to be the best street sweeper. It's a tongue twister, and so that, when you leave this life, someone will say, or when you leave this place, here worked, one of God's greatest street sweepers, or something to that effect. But it was that for them to be encouraged, even in the time of war, to know that their education makes a difference. And he talked about Black hair. He was kind of conservative. He hadn't yet gone with the afro, right? But we were in that era where Black is beautiful. Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. All of that's happening as well. Dr. King was still rather conservative in his dress and also his appearance, but Fred Ahmed Evans was not. There were people who were embracing this sort of Afrocentric presentation of self, and people like Carl Stokes who were listening to those young activists who were saying, we need to define ourselves and choose new names. And so there was that kind of radicalism that wouldn't allow people who were on that side of that cultural kind of protest movement in the 1960s to stand arm in arm with Dr. King and participate in those marches. So again, these are some heady times, right? But I think Jim Robinoff, to look at a more recent publication than just quoting the speeches, which are absolutely amazing in this volume by Dr. King, but to look at ballots and bullets, and Jim Robinoff is an attorney, but he looked at the law and how Dr. King understood it, and how he came to believe that he could use the law, like other members of the NAACP, as a tool, in this ongoing struggle for Black rights in this country, and that he could do it nonviolent. So, yeah, I think that's a sort of user friendly. It's not quite the textbook with, and there are notes, right, that will tell you where to find things that you're looking for, like that recording of the Glenville State. Jim Robinaugh has really good notes in his book.
That's awesome. Well, Dr. Williams, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening and being with us tonight. I am incredibly grateful that you shared your expertise and your passion with us as we celebrate Black History Month. So thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And before we end tonight's program, I want to share with you a couple other opportunities for you to engage and stay connected to our John Carroll University community. All of you are invited to a special discussion with Keith Beauchamp, writer and producer of the movie Till, which tells the tragic story of Emmett Till, who was abducted, tortured, and lynched in Mississippi in 1955. The discussion will take place on Thursday, February 23rd at 4 p.m. in the Dolan Science Center, Dolan Center for Science and Technology at John Carroll. On Saturday, February 25th, members of our Black Alumni Network are invited to join current students and members of the Black Students in Action at Karamu House for production of Red Summer. Red Summer shares the powerful story of the summer of 1919, which marks the culmination of steady growing tensions surrounding the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to cities of the North that took place during World War I. Attendees are also invited to a social prior to the show at the Tudor Arms Hotel in Cleveland. And then I also ask you to save the date for John Carroll University's Founders Day on April 19th and Day of Giving on April 20th. These 2 days help JCU honor its history and inspire its future. The university will host a variety of events on campus, throughout the nation, and online for members of our community to engage through. Additional information will be shared in the near future. And finally, for those who graduated in the years ending in 3 or 8, you are invited back to John Carroll for your alumni reunion on June 9th and June 10th, 2023. Additional information about all of these programs can be found at jcu.edu/alumni. Finally, please consider a charitable gift to John Carroll in support of our students, our faculty, and our entire campus community. If you already made a gift this year, thank you for your generosity. If you have not, please join me in supporting John Carroll at jcu.edu/give so that we can continue to deliver an outstanding education for our current and future Blue Streaks.